Okay, so in this lesson I'm going to show you how to do underpainting. Underpainting is a technique, or rather more of a method, that artists use, most artists would use, to plan the tones in a painting, plan the tonal composition in a painting before they'd apply the actual painting itself on top, in other words the colours. So the reason we do an underpainting is to take care of the tonal composition before we go on and we deal with the colours, because if we were trying to compose the colours at the same time that we were trying to get the tones in balance in the painting, that would be a pretty complicated business, and we don't want to have to, you know, deal with the stress of that, if you will. So I'm just going to I'm going to work with this composition, this assembly of objects here in front of me, and I'm going to use a very small page so that you can see what I'm doing on camera. This paper is 300 GSM, that's 300 grams per square meter. If you're going to paint on paper, you should never use any less than 300 grams per square meter. Otherwise the paper is liable to cockle, which means that it'll basically begin to get a lot of unruly bumps in the surface of the paper, which means that the water will dry unevenly and the paint will dry unevenly on the surface. So this is a 300 GSM paper. It's meant for watercolour, but it's fine for acrylic painting as well. Or you can use a canvas, of course. We tend to use both in my classes. Painting on paper is not as widely recognised, I would say, by people who are beginning to paint, but there are a lot of artists who paint directly onto paper rather than onto canvas. So the first thing I'm going to do is, after moving these brushes out of the way, is I'm going to just sketch out the basic shapes of what's in front of me. So I'm going to, and one tip to at this stage is you want to fit what you're drawing into the expanse of the paper that you're dealing with. So what I like to do is I like to imagine an imaginary line going from one extent of the total assembly of objects to the other. So in this case I'm going to imagine that there's an imaginary line, from my point of view, going from the top of the teapot here to the bottom of the bottom apple over here. And if you can imagine that line, then you can draw that line onto the piece of paper. And you can make that line as big as you want on the piece of paper. The effect of making it almost as big as the piece of paper is that the rest of the composition will have to be scaled up to that size. So it means that you'll get a pretty big set of objects which will fit quite well into the piece of paper. Now you need to be careful that you don't make it too tall and then the entire composition will be too long for the piece of paper. So I have a feeling that that's what's going to happen with my current setup. So I'm actually going to reduce the size of the line, and here it is. And then I'm going to, as I said, I'm going to draw in the rough shapes of different objects. So I'm going to take the teapot, and I'm just going to use very simple shapes at the beginning, the simplest shapes that I can find in the objects that are in front of me. So the teapot would almost be like a ball. So I'm going to draw a kind of a gourd shape for the main part of the teapot. And really what I'm doing at this stage is I'm getting these objects into position. I'm not even concerned with the details at this point. And then I've got one apple, which I'm going to make slightly larger than that. One, and then another one here. And another one here. And I can check the scale as I go along to make sure that they're in the right position, that they're the right scaling in relation to one another. So So I think I could actually move this apple that's in front of me back a little bit, or maybe the apple that's behind it. I'm going to move the apple that's behind it. I feel like I can see less of the apple than I thought that I could. And then the other apple, you'll notice that I'm putting a bit more pressure on the pencil as I'm drawing the second position of the apple. That's because I want to keep the lines clear for myself. So I always start off by drawing very lightly on the page, and then as I progress and I make corrections, maybe the new position of the apple here, I'll press on the pencil, drawing a deeper line, and that'll keep the current position of objects on the page clear for myself as I'm looking at the drawing, and while I'm still working with the drawing. I need to know exactly where they are. So I don't want all these kind of confusing lines that are the same depth of line. I want to have them at different positions. I want to have them with different depths of line so that everything is communicated very clearly. Okay, so I'm going to move this apple over a little bit. And again, I'm pressing on the pencil a little bit more so that things are clear. I don't need to rub anything out because I can see that that line is definitely deeper than the former position of that line. And then I can see that the bottom of the teapot is coming down to about here. So I'm kind of getting a new position for the entire teapot just from what I've just drawn. It's shifting over to the left a bit, and again deepening the line to keep it visible to myself, to keep it clear for myself. And then we come to the butternut squash, which is over on the left, or sorry, on the right. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to draw an imaginary line down the middle of the butternut squash, because the butternut squash is roughly symmetrical. With any object that's roughly symmetrical, it's always useful to draw an imaginary line right down the centre of it, so that you can then judge the distance of one side of it to the other, as I'll just demonstrate now. So I'm going to draw one side of the butternut squash. And then the other, and my line is approximately in the center between the two of those. So then I can see that this side is, say this distance from here is approximately the same to that distance from there, so everything remains in symmetry. And then the last object is this pot, so I'm going to draw the pot in as a cylinder first. And how high does it come up? Well, it comes up almost to the top of the teapot. I'm going to just draw that in behind the butternut squash. And I'm going to quickly put in the shape of the lid, because we need to progress to the painting part. And then we have a few lines in the background as well, just to make sure that these objects are not floating in the middle of the page. At the moment they kind of look like they're floating in space, and this is very common when people start drawing or painting, that they'll draw objects and they'll seem like they're just floating there in the middle of a white page. So in order to make them look like they're actually sitting on something, it's very useful to put the context in, to put what's around the objects in. So I'm just going to put the sheet of paper, the white sheet of paper, the edges of it in, so that we kind of know where these objects are sitting. And another thing that's useful is to put in the shadows underneath the objects. I'm just going to draw the shapes of the shadows. Again, I'm only dealing here with simple shapes, very, very simple shapes, and no details. So for the underpainting we won't be dealing with details whatsoever. All we'll be doing is drawing simple shapes and then filling in masses of tone, no details, nothing that's like a line or a dot or a dash, but just areas of tone and large areas of tone. So I'm just going to put in the spout of the teapot. Just get that in place. And the handle of the teapot. I'm just going to trace where the lid is going to be. There it is. And then I'm going to put the handle in behind. It's not quite in the right position, but again, never fear, because I can deepen the line at the back of the. I can deepen the line for the new position of the handle, so that it is very clearly communicated to myself and to anybody who's looking, really, including yourselves. So there is the new position of the handle. Okay, so to get on to, I'm just going to put the front of the sheet of paper in here as well, and maybe the top of the butternut squash. And really, there's a little area under the lid here that's important as well for me. So I'll put in the lid of the pot and the shadow that's underneath. Just to give myself, really what I want to do is just indicate as I said before, the approximate areas of different tones. So I'm going to be dealing with dark tones, middle tones and light tones, and there'll only be 3 categories of tones. Of course there are many tones that would fall into categories in between light, middle and dark, but we want to keep it very simple for the underpainting. So if you observe a tone, you're going to have to categorize it into as a light tone, as a middle tone or as a dark tone, and you're going to have to make a decision about that. But most tones will be easy enough to see and to approximate into a light, a middle or a dark. Okay, so to move on to the painting part, let's get our brush out. One way people struggle very often with seeing exactly what's a dark, a middle and a light. And a very obvious reason for that is that when people are looking at objects like this that are in colour,